took shape in the aftermath of the financial crisis and began to thoughtfully consider our role as a faith community to address issues of economic justice and nonviolence. So we have with us today 4 members of the Economic Justice and Nonviolence Task Force, and I will take a quick moment here to introduce all of them that will be speaking and then turn the floor over to them. I will start on my far right, and there'll be a familiar face there, Mr. Charlie Riley. As you know, he is a past senior warden and has been a vibrant and dynamic leader, has helped us to transform in many profound ways here at All Saints, calling us to stretch our minds and our commitments to being stewards of our financial resources and true to our mission and call. To his left is Cecil Hoffman. He's been a member of All Saints for 5 years. He is currently on the lay guidance counseling ministry as a supervisor. He's a retired Presbyterian minister and also a psychologist. So we look forward to having him here this morning. To his left is Jonathan Williams. He's a visual artist by trade. He's also been at All Saints for 5 years with his son Dove and his wife Kim. He describes himself and his wife as practitioners of nonviolent parenting, something that he'll be sharing with us today. And to right behind me is Robin Smith. And Robin has been with us at All Saints for 12 years. She's served on the steering committee for Sustainable World, and she's an attorney by trade, always seeking justice for individuals, sometimes against corporations that may be trying to do them harm. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome Robin as the chair of the Economic Justice and Nonviolence Task Force.
Thank you, Will, and good morning, everyone. So quickly, here's what we're going to cover today. I'm going to talk about the working group and what we've been thinking about and what we're planning. Jonathan is going to cover nonviolent parenting. Cecil will talk about praying with your feet. Charlie is giving us a disturbing economic update. And I will finish with a vision and next steps, hoping everyone's inspired. So I wanted to start today with a quote from the Dr. King's Vietnam speech. A true revolution of values will soon cause us to question the fairness and justice of many of our past and present policies. On the one hand, we are called to play the Good Samaritan on life's roadside, but that will only be an initial act. One day, we must come to see the whole Jericho Road must be transformed so that men and women will not be constantly beaten and robbed as they make their journey on life's highway. True compassion is more than flinging a coin to a beggar. It is not haphazard and superficial. It comes to see that an edifice which produces beggars needs restructuring. And here is a cartoon. I don't know if you can see it very well, but it epitomizes the current system we have with a beggar starving and alone and a wealthy man with a cup of money who is savings and loan. And he's saying, is this a great country or what? So last year at the Vestry conference, a small economic justice working group team went through very quickly 9 different areas, and these are the areas that were covered. And we could have added a lot more than that. And so as a working group, what we've been discussing is how can All Saints have a greater impact towards transforming the Jericho Road. Last fall, we started forming a working group composed of a group of people who had studied the nonviolent method with Reverend Lawson and a group of people who were interested in economic justice. And we started having discussions on how can we do this. And we really used 2 paradigms to focus our discussions. The first is Reverend Lawson's nonviolent method, which has 3 steps that he talks about. To study and learn all the facets of the problem and explore the power leverages, to strategize and launch a nonviolent training and strategy, plan and direct a direct action campaign, and build community and networks, and then launch into the direct action campaign. But we also considered Walter Brueggemann's, how he explains how the people of Israel were transformed through the Exodus experience, and he does this in his book, Hope Within History. And he talks about how it started with a critique of the dominant ideology, moved into public processing of pain, and he says, the cry of pain begins the formation of a counter-community around an alternative perception of reality, and then the release of new social imagination. So keeping in mind these paradigms, we asked, how do we explore these issues as a parish? How can we as a parish focus on an economic justice issue where we can actually have an impact? Now, this is a challenging task at All Saints because we have so much passion around so many issues, which is a really terrific and wonderful thing. But also for us to really focus, if we fly off in a lot of different directions, we have less of an impact. So this is this tension between how can we focus ourselves to have a larger impact, but at the same time encourage all the wonderful things that are going on and people are interested in at All Saints. So it's time for a radical revolution in values. And we have decided to approach this a different way, rather than picking a topic and sort of saying, here's what we're going to do, All Saints, which we don't think would work anyway, to come at it at a different direction. And these ideas came to us when we were visited by John Philip Newell, David Corton, Serene Jones, and Cornel West all in the same week. It was an incredible week. All of these thinkers, to some extent, talked about the need for a radical revolution in values. And David Corton discussed how our cultural and societal and national stories don't mesh with what we're experiencing, and how we don't realize that the extent to which our stories, including our cosmology story about the origin and nature of the universe, influence our behavior. And these are a couple of quotes that I think really say what the problem is. First is Thomas Berry. For people generally, their story of the universe and the human role in the universe is their primary source of intelligibility and value. The deepest crisis experienced by any society are those moments of change when the story becomes inadequate for meeting the survival demands of a present situation. And John Philip Newell says that it can be argued that we are in a time of greatest change that humanity has ever known. So the question is, how do we respond to this? And David Corton talked about how there are two cosmologies that have been dominant in our society and that we hear about and sort of lead to how we structure our economy and our political system. The first is the distant patriarch religion, which emphasizes an individual relationship with a personal God whose home is in a separate dimension, emphasizes that our human relationships with one another and with nature are secondary as a result of that. And in many interpretations, life on Earth is but a way station and nature solely exists for our use and comfort. And this is a picture I took on Glendale Boulevard between Echo Park and Silver Lake. I'm sure many of you have seen this billboard, and I've never called the 1855 number to find out what the truth is, but it's it kind of epitomizes this distant God idea. The second sort of dominant cosmology is what David Corton calls the grand machine idea of science, that the universe and the evolution of life are consequences of a combination of physical mechanism and random change that have no larger meaning or purpose. There's a brutal competition for survival is the basic law of nature, and it neglects the role of cooperation and synergy on which all living systems and human society depend. Both cosmologies affirm the self-destructive individualism and separation that lead us to relate to one another and to nature in deeply destructive ways. And another quote from John Philip Newell, "We have lived in a deep falseness to think we could take care of the needs of our own family while ignoring the well-being of the family down the street, and to think that we could be truly healthy while we're infecting the earth." The good news is that this breakdown, what Joan Halifax calls a breakdown, she says it offers us the opportunity for a new kind of enlightenment. And Joan Halifax is a Buddhist practitioner. She's really incredible. And so the question is, what if we turn this economic and environmental crisis into a love story? Well, the alternative to these cosmologies, Corton calls the integral spirit. It is the merging of science, biology and quantum physics, and religion, which sees the oneness and interconnectedness of everything. And so we think of the Eastern religions and we think of our own mystical traditions. In the integral spirit cosmology, God is in the world and the world is in God, yet they are not identical. All of creation is a sacred expression of an eternal and intimately divine will. All beings are interconnected and our fates are intertwined. And as participants in the ongoing process of creation, we each bear a sacred responsibility. Our lives take on profound meaning and purpose in relationship and service to the sacred whole. This really comes through. I don't know how many of you were able to watch the overview video of the astronauts, but I think they really talk about what happened to them when they saw that the Earth was this one whole. It's a really incredible video. And it's also, again, something that I think comes through with John Philip Newell. He said the growing consciousness of interrelatedness is the deep spirit of this moment in time. We have two choices: to further fragmentation and destruction of the species, or transformation and healing, giving up your life to save it, truly following Jesus rather than following the ego of nation, species, religion, etc. And I think Cornel West also touched on this. Christ is our memory. He embodies what is deep within us and a yearning for oneness. And he said we need to access Jesus' energy of nonviolence for true transformation. So what if the third story guided our economic, environmental, and political decisions? So David Korten created this chart, and on the left side, you have the two cosmologies lead to an old suicide economy, which values money and self and organizes towards environmental collapse, wealth concentration, and political corruption. But if you organize based on the third integral spirit cosmology, you have a new living economy that values life and self and organizes towards earth balance, shared prosperity, and living democracy. And it would turn, a new cosmology would turn sort of how we value, how we prioritize rights in the opposite direction. So rather than valuing corporations first, we would value nature and so forth. Nature, then humans, then property, and then corporations at the bottom. These are not new ideas. They are ancient ideas, and certainly were raised again by Dr. King. And here's just one quote. This call for a worldwide fellowship that lifts neighborly concern beyond one's tribe, race, class, and nation is in reality a call for an all-embracing and unconditional love for all men. This has now become an absolute necessity for the survival of man. So what's next? The integral spirit cosmology is not a story we hear in the public domain, ever. The absence of public visibility limits its influence as a guide to rethinking and restructuring our human relationships with one another and nature. And so then the question becomes, how can we, as a parish, articulate and amplify narratives that will lead to systemic change and support the needs of the entire human family? So I will end with sort of where we are planning to go as a working group. And in the meantime, the three of our other panelists will talk, and I will circle back. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, my name is Jonathan Williams, and my small part of this is really just to tell a story and to talk a little bit about how I have begun to, and I really stress that, how I've begun to integrate nonviolence into my family life, into my personal life. And for me, it all started with an overheard conversation at a party, and I'll get to that in a minute. My son Dove was 2 years old, and my wife Kim and I were beginning to feel overwhelmed. I mean, this was a wonderful experience, but we were feeling overwhelmed, and I found myself one afternoon in the hallway in front of my son's bedroom, and I was hanging onto the door handle, pulling as hard as I could, and yelling at him that he had to take a nap. And you know, as a parenting tip, I'll tell you right now that that's really not a but he likewise was on the other side, pulling as hard as he could and trying to come out and saying, Dad, I just want to come out. I don't want to take a nap. I don't want to take a nap. And it involved a little bit of panic on my part, honestly, because I knew that I really needed this time. We'd come to look forward to it. I needed some rest. I needed a little break from taking care of him. So I knew what my needs were. I came later to understand that he also had his needs, and he was expressing them as best as he could. But in that moment, standing outside the doorway, I was not at my best as a parent, and I knew that I needed some more information. I needed some help. And when I told Kim this story, she said the same thing had happened to her the day before. So we were both ready for some new stuff. And at the party, I overheard a conversation between two friends who were talking about getting parenting class organized to be offered by the Center for Nonviolent Education and Parenting, which is a nonprofit in my neighborhood, founded by a woman named Ruth Beaglehole, and it's now known as Echo Parenting and Education. They had a name change. Anyway, the classes that we took were held at my friend's house, and they also, the primary classes are Saturday morning classes in English and in Spanish at the United Methodist Church in my neighborhood. So the first thing we learned was, or the first thing that really took hold of me was what does nonviolence look like with regard to child rearing? And I came to view violence to children as anything that harms a child's body, mind, heart, or spirit. And I learned other things, and the classes were 10 classes, and I learned about the importance of identifying my own needs in relation to my own feelings. I learned about empathy. I learned a little bit about neuroscience research, child development information. I learned about empathy, how to give it, what it is. And I learned, I was talking about the neuroscience, I learned also about how our personal narratives of how we were raised inform how we raise our children. And a really important one is self-empathy. This is the ability to forgive ourselves when we screw up. And I think it's a profoundly important concept, which I think without it, you can't really consciously help your children. I'm going to go to page 2. Oh, this is where I push the button. Yeah. So this is a chart. It's not a chart. It's not even a diagram. It's more of a mandala or something. It doesn't tell you how to do anything, but this is what I like to kind of try to keep in mind. What a nonviolent heart honors. It goes out towards children's dreams. It goes out toward their deep-seated memories. Even prenatal memories have an effect on who children are and how they feel. Creativity, temperament, traits, gifts, their dignity, sacredness, child's mind, his life force. So other things I learned were that all of us spend most of our lives seeking to have our core emotional needs met. And these needs fall roughly into the categories of affection, attention, acceptance, appreciation, and autonomy. At Echo Parenting, we had another category, connection. And with these tools and information, it became clear to me that any hope that we have to promote justice in this world must incorporate nonviolence. And as parents, we are creating the future. How can we hope to create a compassionate world if children are not experiencing compassion at home? So many of the ways that parents discipline children ignore these basic human needs that we share. Some examples are when we use shame to teach lessons, or when we threaten or intimidate children. Here's one. Can you remember what it felt like? You should be ashamed of yourself, Ed Bacon. Or if you don't stop that right now, I'm going to whatever. Or what's this other one I had here? Oh, I know. Go to your room, Ed Bacon. I don't even want to talk to you. So, we don't accept shaming as a part of a loving relationship between adults. And why is shame an accepted part of loving relationships with children? I believe that it violates children's spirit. I'm really having trouble reading this here. I don't have very good eyes and I don't have enough light. But I do believe that it violates children's spirit when we punish. And even when we reward children for behavior, because that's a conditional parenting and it yields conditional behavior. We want children to develop values and behavior intrinsically, which they can only do when we model these same qualities for them. And I haven't even mentioned spanking, which I understand that 80% of children experience at some point. So my daily practice of nonviolence means that I am curious about what's underneath my child's behavior, so that he'll feel felt and know that I value his spirit, even when his behavior for some reason is improper or childlike or unacceptable. For example, like maybe we can't have that ice cream cone right before dinner. I mean, as a parent, I can hold that limit, but I can still mourn with my child for that dream of the ice cream cone that is a real dream for him that won't be fulfilled. So that's what it means to parent unconditionally. And it means to hold the limit and to hold the feelings at the same time. So at about the same time that I took these classes, I was beginning to attend services at All Saints. And I was considering baptizing Dove, and I started with a conversation with Wendy Berry, who suggested that I also talk to Wilma Jacobson. And this act of introducing Dove to the community was also my introduction. I needed to explore my reasons for wanting to baptize him. And through the liturgy and sermons that I heard here, I drew parallels to what I was learning through classes and participation in eco-parenting. Values such as forgiveness, interdependence, community, love, connectedness, and social justice messages, which are treated here from the pulpit, are also addressed likewise in support groups and in classes at eco-parenting. So these parallels were emphasized for me during the Lenten workshops by Reverend James Lawson last year, and everyone in the room was eager to find ways to put nonviolence to work for social change. How could we integrate the practice of nonviolence into our lives, and how could we achieve social justice goals with nonviolent strategies? And I realized that in my life, one way or another, this work had already begun. And so I set out to share the parenting philosophy with other parishioners as a starting point. With the help of Wilma and Laura Thornton, we arranged for Ruth Beaglehole to speak here a few times. And a couple of class sessions grew out of that. And Laura and Cooper took classes along with several parents involved in God, My Parents, and Me, and the parent culture group. So I'm hoping to expand on that. And I'd really like to move forward strongly from that foothold that we've established. I've come to believe that this model for parenting differently can change the world. And the change starts within ourselves. We become models for others, and most of all, for our children. And we can be the change that we seek. Imagine a world in which all children are raised with care in order to care for others. I mean, if we seek justice, economic or otherwise, what better way to start than to renounce this dominance and suppression model of parenting and substitute one grounded in unconditional love which honors children and their beloved exalted selves. So the way I chose to further this work is by participating in this group, and in the fall we're going to recommend to you something dramatic to take to the congregation. We will want it shouted from the rooftops. And I'm just asking you to advocate for the narrative of what it means really to live in a free society, which is to be free of want and also free from violence. So thank you very much.
First, let me say thank you to Ed and the rest of the pastoral staff and to the Vestry and all who make All Saints happen for so many, including Pat and me at All Saints. Come here Sunday morning with whatever's going on internally, whatever changes that I'm coping with in life, and through the inspired preaching, the wonderful music, and the Eucharistic liturgy, it's transformational for me, and such an important anchoring place to come to and to be part of. Wonderful, wonderful place. The gospel is really spoken here and enacted here, and that love so amazing, so divine that we reflect on during the Lenten season is taken very seriously here and truthfully here, and I'm very thankful. My admiration for All Saints Church began a long time ago, actually, during the Vietnam War. And I was the university pastor at USC for the Presbyterians and some other denominations at that time. And clergy and laymen concerned, or laity as we would say it now, concerned about the war in Vietnam was being formed. A group was being formed by George Regas and I think Leonard Bierman. And that's when I first heard about All Saints. I've been grieving over the increasing dominance of private gain over common good in our country. And the harm that this has done to so many families who bear the brunt of the scandalous transfer of wealth and power from the many to the few. Having worked with the poor as a psychologist in a community mental health agency and as a psychotherapist in private practice, I've seen close up the emotional toll of poverty, financial hardship, unemployment. And I wanted to join with other people of faith to address the economic inequality of our time. So I was very pleased to be invited to be part of the working group on economic justice and nonviolence at All Saints. It was an answer to prayer. What we're up against became clear to me after reading Jacob Hacker and Paul Pearson's Winner-Take-All Politics, how Washington made the rich richer and turned its back on the middle class. The authors give a thorough history of how the American political system has been hijacked by the super rich over the last 3 decades. They show how both Democrats and Republicans have participated in dismantling government regulations, changing tax policies to favor excessive private gain, and weakening labor unions. My first call after seminary, when I graduated in 1958, was to an ecumenically sponsored ministry in Mendota, California, in the San Joaquin Valley, working with agricultural workers and their families and doing community organizing in that area. This is pre-Cesar Chavez times, although I did have a chance to meet him in the early days before the union was formed. Early in that ministry, one autumn morning, Pat and I were at the breakfast table looking out our window at a long line and a big crowd of farm workers in our driveway, and just kind of waiting in the cold out there. And we wondered about it, and we discovered that the property next to our house we lived in was one of the sites for weekly food distribution among the jobless months of high family need, when the melon and the cotton picking was over, and there was 3 months of no food for so many families, and it was brought out in trucks from the Fresno County Department of Public Welfare. I was surprised to learn that agricultural workers were excluded from nearly all the benefits workers in other industries took for granted. No minimum wage law coverage, no unemployment insurance. Also, they were excluded from the state disability insurance program. They were specifically excluded from national labor relations law governing the right to form unions. The more I saw, the more I became convinced that Christian witness required more than evangelism and social service. Advocacy by the church for just economic conditions was imperative. The poverty of farm workers was calling the church to seriously address the root causes of the California harvest of shame. So fortunately, when Caesar and the farm workers movement emerged to address these root causes, many concerned church people joined in support of the union movement, participating in boycotts of grapes and engaging in a variety of nonviolent actions. It was a hopeful time, and many, many important changes were made by that nonviolent action with the farm workers movement. One of my hopes for our working group is to increase opportunities for All Saints members to participate in organized nonviolent actions on behalf of economic justice. Lending our voice and our bodily presence to public witness has great value for the cause we are supporting, and it can be transformational for us. Archbishop Tutu calls it praying with your feet. Nonviolent public action is a great way to get educated as well. This last fall, a group of a dozen or so of us from All Saints Church joined Carissa and Pam, Robin and Francisco in a march and rally in support of the warehouse and Walmart workers' protest. We heard firsthand stories from the workers who were risking their jobs for modest changes in hours and working conditions. Being there, marching with them, having a meal with them, brought home the reality of their concerns in a way that one could never obtain from the distance. Secondly, besides being educative for us to participate in nonviolent action, it also is a way to keep your hope alive and to encourage others. 2 weeks ago, Pat and I took the Gold Line to Union Station to join the LA demonstration of support for the massive climate action in Washington, D.C. This was to encourage President Obama to do the right thing and oppose the 1,700-mile-long Keystone XL pipeline, referred to as a carbon bomb. Preparation for the action involved preparing signs to take with us. So I went online to 350.org and clicked on signs for climate action, and they had a generic sign that said, "Another blank for climate action." And I was trying to think of what to put in that blank to identify myself. And I thought, well, I could be Christian, and that might be refreshing to those that see the big sign, "Believe or fry in hell." But then I was not representing any specific organization, so at that day I couldn't put All Saints down. So I thought, well, who's going to suffer the most from our failure to act on climate And I thought of my grandkids and my one great-granddaughter, and I know that they're facing the results of what we've been doing to our atmosphere. And so it was another grandfather for climate action. And so Pat came with another grandmother, and we took the gold line down to Union Station, and people kind of looked at us in the gold line, and we actually had a couple of thumbs up there. And then we joined the rally at Eldera Street and marched to City Hall. And it was really interesting how many of the young people that were there would keep, giving us thumbs up, and they wanted to take our photo and so forth. And they said, thank you. They were encouraged by our participation. And this is certainly something that happens when you engage, even though you don't have to be grandfathers and grandmothers to be appreciated on the march or at the rally. So let me just say this. Hearing Cornel West describe justice as what love looks like in public really summed up so much. And for me, and another time, in another talk he gave, he spoke of justice as love on legs spilling over into the public sphere. Called forth in love, may we pursue thoughtfully and boldly an All Saints Church vision for economic justice. Thank you.
All right. Jerry turned me on to this little daily Brother Give Us a Word, I don't know, a year and a half, 2 years ago. And Grace and the good brothers of St. John the Evangelist, never to disappoint, this morning's word was collaboration. So fitting given the work that's going on here and the transformation that we're looking to accomplish both here in the parish and in the wider world. All right, so real quickly, this is the world as it is, not the world we want it to be, so that disclaimer right up front. I'll run through kind of what the latest conditions look like and from a lot of different perspectives. The economy the last decade or so, debt was sure fun while it lasted. The state of our so-called financial system, one quick shot at federal finances. Here on the day when sequestration takes effect, what that looks like, and then the impacts in lives around jobs, employment, housing, income, and wealth. So after initially printing with a negative 0.1% growth rate for the fourth quarter of 2012, GDP yesterday was just revised upwards by 0.2 of a point to show a positive of 0.1% for the fourth quarter of 2012. This in a quarter when people pulled all kinds of income forward out of 2013 into the fourth quarter of 2012, not knowing what the fiscal cliff held. Consensus for the sequester going into effect today is that it will pull between 0.5 point and 0.6 of a point off of GDP growth for the year and eliminate likely 750,000 to 1 million jobs. The continuing challenges in the existing economic paradigm that we live through is this idea of excess household debt, the condition of people in the household, and the potential longer-term potential problems, and I stress potential, around excessive government debt. So how do we get the economy growing again? Again, in the sort of place where we've been thinking about the economy. You can make an argument, and I certainly would make the argument, I shared a bunch of books with Ed about this, that the world is at a place where we're reaching almost a stasis. We've pulled all the rich resources out of the planet. We have to recycle all those resources and look to a different model than a continuous growth model that we've had. Inside this model, can we get a rate of growth that's high enough to reduce unemployment? Scott kind of touched on the fact that it's not coming down. And also reduce household debt, while at the same time not letting the government balance sheet, debt explode. And all of this is a chart on the left side is the percentage of 25 to 49-year-olds in the U.S. It goes back to 1980. And everybody thought that Reagan economy was so great and attributed all that to Ronald Reagan and all those, policies. It really is a demographic issue. When you have people who are 25 to 49 years old, they're in the household formation phase of their lives. The number of those people is growing. Your marrying, you're buying a house, you're furnishing a house, you're having children. It's just acquisition, 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 acquisition. The size of the consumer pool was growing like crazy. The economy naturally followed. We're now on the downslope of that and the upslope of aging. You may have heard people talk about the output gap. This is what the output gap looks like. You see for a long time, going back to 2000, that green line, that squiggly line, is the actual GDP growth rate, or actual total GDP. And the potential, or if we used every bit of the resources and applied all the labor that we have in the economy, that line would be the potential GDP. You can see that we're underperforming what the potential of the economy currently is. In the same window, corporate profits go parabolic. And this is my slide that I love to call How the U.S. Worker is Getting Screwed. If you look at the blue line is GDP over time. You can see the giant collapse in 2008, 2009, and then we're recovering. We're now, the total size of the economy is bigger than what it was before the crisis, and yet there are almost 7 million fewer jobs. At a time where labor share of our national income, going clear back to 1940, is just literally falling off the page. Something is structurally and fundamentally changing how we're managing and running the economy. And if you look at it, on a GDP basis, the same. Here's something, I kind of made that comment about robots. This is the rise of the bot in our world. And yes, there is a lot of manufacturing coming back to the US, and it's being done by precision robots. The blue lines show those are actual robots in production facilities. That top line is the manufacturing output per hour. And so these machines are able to just make incredibly productive factories. This is a new force. I mean, there certainly has been automation in the past. This is really fundamentally changing. So you look at the left side here, and that's the average of the last, 5 or 6 recoveries. The top line being sales from the trough, from that lowest point of the contraction. And sales come back, labor compensation comes back, and then corporate profits kind of recover. And then to the right, you look at the recovery from 2008. It's completely different from what all of our experience has been. Corporate profits are coming screaming back, even with declining sales there. So, and you see how labor compensation drops down below those profits. Essentially, companies just laid off millions of people, kept the money for themselves, even in light of those declining sales. So if it feels completely different, it's because it is completely different. And this is the soup line is in the mail. I mean, it's sort of a ugly characterization. Everybody says, I don't see the suffering or whatever, but that's because it's invisible. It's in the form of EBT cards that get refilled on the final day of the month, and that Walmart sees a spike in milk sales at 2 a.m. on the following morning. Record high numbers of people on disability, record high numbers of people receiving food stamps. So last decade or so. Nobody needs to see another debt chart, but this is essentially what's happened. There's a whole decoupling that happens in 1980 where this thing becomes untethered and debt just starts growing across all sectors of our economy. The household, non-financial business, financial businesses, and government. The flip side of debt is financial assets. If I loan money to you, it's an asset to me and it's a liability to you. So you can see that since 1990 up through 2000, there's a quadrupling of financial assets, paper assets throughout the world. And that's just the flip side of seeing debt grow like crazy. And you can see there's sort of this uneasy equilibrium that we've settled into at around $200 trillion in worldwide financial assets. And you say, okay, well, using leverage, if I borrow money today to actually build something into the future, it might give me more value. This is a chart that takes the net worth of households and divides it by total debt. So that if it's a positive number, if that were going up, you'd say, okay, adding leverage into the system is actually allowing me to create more wealth, or actually having the exact opposite happen. as we add in more wealth, and we look at the actual formation of wealth, or add in more debt, as we're actually not seeing the kind of wealth formation happen. I want to call attention to student loans, because I really believe that's going to be the next crisis that we collectively face. Back in 2004, a little over $300 billion, a pretty staggering number. Now over $1 trillion in student loans outstanding. And thanks to the Congress of the United States, student loan debt is not dischargeable in bankruptcy, which is just insane to me. It's the single largest kind of debt outstanding for people, only behind mortgages. And if you look at the number of borrowers, this is people that in a tough economy have to do, all this training, retraining, skills acquisition, all this, going to these crappy for-profit colleges, which are just the most immoral, crazy thing in the world. Numbers of borrowers, over nearly 40 million borrowers. Average balance, $25,000. These aren't insubstantial debts. And lo and behold, if you look at 2004, 2008, and 2012, in the blue, red, and green, delinquencies are starting to soar across every single age range. So you have over $1 trillion of debt, not dischargeable in bankruptcy, growing like crazy and starting to go back. Hence, this is a picture of the 30-year mortgage rates, going back to 1970. Generational lows. Just no number lower on the chart than where we are today. This is the Fed, total, all that debt. One way to make the debt a little bit more affordable is to drop the price on it. Government's able to borrow money for 10 years at around 1.75%. No hint of all the default that the Republicans would have you believe that is imminent, other than them unwilling to increase the debt ceiling. And you look at the 6 largest banks, all the too big to fails, we've made them too big to bail. They've increased their total assets since before the crisis by 40%. Just insanity. Look at central banks, which are sort of the banks around the world that can create digital money by just crediting the only people in the world that get to make a one-sided accounting entry. Here's the money. They've just consistently blown up their balance sheets, increasing money throughout the entire world. You look at our own Fed. I know this is a little bit of an eye chart, but it's very, very telling, because it shows where mortgages go to die. On the left-hand side, before the crisis, the Fed, our U.S. Fed, had about an $800 billion balance sheet. Its total assets were about $800 billion. The crisis, starting in 2009, the black line is Treasury bonds that the Fed buys in the open market from its banking owners. And then the red line, starting in 2009 with QE1, are the mortgages that it buys. You can see it takes off from 0 and ends up at nearly $1.2 trillion. That red line kind of falls off until we turn QE3 back on. The only reason the red line comes down is because mortgages, you make your payment every month, and so they're returning money to the Fed, and the Fed is actually recycling the money out of the mortgage purchases into the purchases of those that go into the black line, into Treasury bonds. And that was what was referred to as QE light. So now we're back in QE3, and the Fed is buying $40 billion a month of mortgage-backed securities. Why I think this is telling is that this is the rescue of the people at the top. This is the Fed engaging in a pure asset swap. They create digital money. What the Fed does is no different than saying, okay, JP Morgan Chase, I want to buy $100 billion of mortgage-backed securities from you. You have these stinking $100 billion worth of stinking and rotting mortgage-backed securities. I'll credit your account at the Fed, make a single-sided entry for $100 billion. You give me those, I bring them on my balance sheet, and that's where mortgages go to die. All of this agita about the Fed printing money and it's going to cause inflation, there's no way in hell it can happen. All of those reserves are excess reserves that are sitting at the Federal Reserve of all these very large banks. It's all a giant asset swap to get the crap off the bank balance sheets into the Fed and allow them all to rot out of the sight of the public. And you look at the Dow Jones, completely severed from economic reality. If you look at the blue line, That's the economy growing over time. And if you see that the stock market, again, starting around 1980, just departs from any correlation to the real economy as financialization just totally took off. Even when we have these huge collapsing of the internet bubble and with the 2008 crash. And then financial regulation. 37 pages of Glass-Steagall was good enough to get us for 70 years without a crisis. Now it takes over nearly 2,500 pages of Dodd-Frank to try to put this monster back into its cage. And thanks to Graham Leach Bliley or the Financial Services Modernization Act in 1999, it just took away Glass-Steagall. So how easy would it be to just go back to Glass-Steagall, 37 pages, simple, keep investment banks on one side, commercial banks on the other. Federal government, touch on this a little bit. Tons of hysteria about the deficit. Well, clearly everything we've seen is we live in a demand-constrained world. People don't have capacity. We'll see in a second what's happening to people's incomes. The blue line, essentially tax receipts to the government. The red line, expenditures the government makes. The United States can never technically default. We've got technology called the printing press. We're the sovereign, we are the sole monopoly issuer of a floating rate currency that we can just print at will. There's no constraint. We can always pay a bill. All of this craziness of comparing the federal government to a household is just wrong, just totally different. But the good news is you actually have, and not good news, the revenues are actually converging with the outlays of the government in a pretty fast rate. You look at sort of the relationship of those two lines. But the reality is that's actually constraining the economy because we could be spending more and allowing the economy to run at a little faster rate. So impacts on jobs and employment. Scariest jobs chart ever. Gets a little less scary as we go through time. But if you look at all those other recoveries, this recovery has just taken a hell of a lot longer, unprecedented since the Second World War. And then if you run projections about how long it would take at the current rate of job creation to recover those jobs, sort of the most realistic one is the one to the far right, that's the green dash, has us in 2022. Jobs that are being created, this is a chart that shows part-time income coming back completely. You come back to work, it goes to this point Scott made about free agent nation. It's just the nature of employment has totally changed. Income, this is a report that came out from the Fed. Income between 2007 and 2010, down on a median basis, so half the households above, half the households below, and median net worth declined by 40%. Median income over time, going back to 2000, nominally up 25%. When adjusted for inflation, the price of things people really buy, down by 8%. And then this is the chart that Jerry had in her senior warden's address. And it really breaks out, if you look at the top 5%, that black dotted line, and then the blue line is the top quintile of the top 20%. That's where every bit of income gains have resided for the last, since really going back to 1965 is where this chart starts. And if you look at, from certainly in the 21st century, if you're in the so-called bottom 80% of the economy, your life, you're just sort of staying even, at best. This is another telling thing. This takes and looks at debt divided by income. It's the debt to income ratio. And the blue line is the bottom 95%. As that debt to income ratio goes up, it's really a measure of how hard, what capacity do I have to pay my bills. It's gotten increasingly more difficult for 95% of the population, while 5% of the population has actually seen its debt load decline. This is interesting because I think it kind of relates to the fiscal cliff conversation at the beginning of the year and all the agita about is it 250,000 or 400,000. If you look at the numbers of households earning $400,000 or more in a year's time, this is based on 2010 IRS data, so about 500,000 households across the entire United States. So we allowed a 2% payroll tax hike to impact those tens of millions of households, and we argued for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks about whether or not 500,000 households that have all the capacity, that received all the income growth, can pay just 4 or 6% more in marginal income tax rates. So housing, this is totally a function of debt. Before the crisis, going back to 2000, total mortgages outstanding in the United States around $5 trillion. At the height of the housing bubble, mortgage debt rose to nearly $11 trillion in the economy. A bunch of that, about $1 trillion of that, just evaporated and went away. Housing prices follow the blue line. And so you can see with all that additional credit in the marketplace, it just like fuel to a fire. It allowed those housing prices to just go up like crazy. And this is something that really makes me insane, is when people talk about mortgage forgiveness and sort of the morality around that. It's like, well, what's the morality if somebody pays an inflated price for a piece of real estate because we had this crazy kind of debt fuel that mispriced that asset to begin with? So that's clearly a way and a policy place that we can continue to advocate, is sort of readjusting mortgage balances. So after all those write-offs, and the Fed initially buying $1.1 trillion in mortgages out of the commercial market space, and now the Fed buying $40 billion, or almost $500 billion a year of mortgages again, mortgage balance got $9.5 trillion at the end of 2012. So I just love this. Jerry had sent this to me, and it ties into the overview effect. It's Edgar Mitchell, who was the Apollo 14 astronaut, that really talks about the transformational impact of being in space and looking back at Earth. It says, you develop an instant global consciousness, a people orientation, an intense dissatisfaction with the state of the world, and a compulsion to do something about it. From out there on the moon, international politics looks so petty. You want to go grab a politician by the scruff of the neck and drag him, her today, versus this, and drive a 250,000 miles out and say, look at that, you son of a bitch. Rob will wrap it up.
Thank you, Charlie. So I know we're running out of time, so I'll try to do this quickly. So those are fire ants. And I want to talk about how I think they're a good metaphor for what we're hoping we will do as a parish. Our vision is to guide the parish through a process of discernment, to start down the path of Reverend Lawson's 3 steps this fall, to move from education and community building to strategizing to organizing and mobilizing for action that will have a greater impact on our unjust economic system. And I see this process as similar to what fire ants do when they are threatened with a flood. They grab hold of each other, making a living raft that can sail for months, hundreds of thousands of them, grab onto each other's legs and mandibles. And pockets of air get trapped around their bodies, and so even the ones at the bottom remain dry, and they're able to breathe because they are not actually underwater. And I think we need to start by holding on to each other so we have a greater strength and capacity to reach outward and to expand the circle of who we are holding on to. So that's just kind of how I see this process. So we hope to facilitate conversations and reflection about what we truly believe and to examine contrasting narratives that impact our lives and our economic and political systems. I think I skipped a, oops. There we go. To explore and learn how economics underlies most injustices, the power leverages involved, and the theological basis for our concern and response. And we really want to challenge every parishioner to somehow engage in this process. And what this means for us is that we have to provide opportunities that will appeal to everyone, because everyone learns in different ways, they engage in different ways, they're interested in different issues. This is a daunting task, but we think it is doable if all of the ministries and vestry committees commit to being part of this and to taking on some piece of it. And we recognize that there are already many ministries and parishioners who are exploring these issues, and we want to support those efforts and connect them into a parish-wide discernment process. And so just some offerings that we could include. We're thinking of starting with a kickoff event in the fall. We would like to ask Richard Parker back to come to this event and to be with us and guide us through this process. And this is a long-term process. I think about Cornell West's revolutionary patience. This is going to take time for us to do together. Forums, another forum, we could continue to explore economic justice, the practice of nonviolence, theology, and how they all intersect with all the different issues that we're facing. Small groups are going to be key. They could involve spiritual practice, book studies, and other kinds of study groups, discussion groups, Bible studies, whatever people can think of, really, that will engage different people in these issues. Experiential learning through transformational journeys, going to protests, sharing food. And we really want to encourage in each of these sort of ways of engaging people, encourage people to share their own economic and other stories that are urgent for them. The kind of stories that are taboo, debts, about economics, about class. We really need to have discussions about all of these issues, and we want to encourage that in each of these groups. But what's really important is that they feed into a larger discernment process, so that you don't go to a book group and then that's the end of it, but that somehow that will feed into something larger, so that we as a parish can decide if there's some way we can have a larger impact on what's happening. Now I have a couple of examples. The Gun Control Working Group, this is another quote from Dr. King, just to show how economics really underlies pretty much every justice issue that there is. And he says, I am convinced we as a nation must undergo a radical revolution of values. We must rapidly begin the shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society. When machines and computers, profit motives, and property rights are considered more important than people, the giant triplets of racism, materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered. So he links three really important types of injustice. So I want to end with, we will be starting outreach this spring, and so we'll be visiting a lot of the ministries and vestry committees to talk to you about what's going on, to try to get people involved and get more input. We want to have a pretty good plan in place before the summer comes around, because everyone disappears during the summer and it gets very difficult to plan. So if any of you are interested in being a part of this, we would welcome your involvement. Please come talk to me. We have a meeting next week on March 7th, so you're welcome to join us. And then